In Romeo and Juliet, Juliet stands on her balcony and asks, "What's in a name?" Well, Juliet. If we're talking about book covers, not much. Because the authors of books like Pride and Prejudice, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, Confessions of a Shopaholic, and a series of unfortunate events didn't use their real names. Today, on 5-Minute Trivia, we explore the world of pen names.
We choose to go to the moon.
Right now, you like me.
Practice? We're talking about practice, man.
Welcome to 5-Minute Trivia, where we make the world smarter 5 minutes at a time. I'm your host, R.M. Zubairi. In 1933, a book called Down and Out in Paris and London became a hit. It was an expose of poverty, meant to show the upper classes of society what it was like to be poor. It was written by a man named Eric Blair, who would go on to become one of the most famous writers of the 20th century. But you wouldn't know him by that name because he didn't use it. Instead, he chose the name of his favorite spot in England, where the river flows through the town of Ipswich. That was the River Orwell, and that is how Eric Blair, author of 1984 and Animal Farm, became forever known as George Orwell. Pen names are really common. Ben Franklin, Joyce Carol Oates, Michael Crichton, Washington Irving, Pearl Buck, J.K. Rowling, Isaac Asimov. Even Stephen King wrote some of his stories under a different name. But why use a pen name? I mean, writing a book is a lot of work, right? Shouldn't people know who you are? Well, in George Orwell's case, he had written a book about his experience with poverty. But he wasn't actually poor. He just wanted to see what it was like. But the things he did, living in a rundown apartment, going hungry, working as a dishwasher, weren't things that people of his background were supposed to do, and it would have been embarrassing to his family. Societal expectations actually come up a lot with authors who hide their identities. Like the Bell brothers. Carrere, Ellis, and Acton Bell are probably the most famous sibling trio in literary history. In 1846, they teamed up to publish a book of poetry. That book sold 2 copies. That's right, there were more names on the cover than there were customers for their poetry book. So how are they famous? Because the Bell brothers are actually sisters. Carrere Bell was the pen name for Charlotte Bronte. She wrote Jane Eyre, the classic tale of a young governess who falls in love with a handsome widower. Except, he's not really a widower. He just keeps his crazy wife locked in the attic until she breaks out and burns the place down. Anyway, it's a classic romance and you should read it. Ellis Bell was Emily Bronte. She wrote Wuthering Heights, another classic. Spooky manners, love triangles, tormented spirits, wandering the moors at night. Wuthering Heights practically invented Gothic literature and also inspired an 80s pop hit by Kate Bush. Acton Bell, the last sister-brother, was Anne Bronte. She's not as well known as the other 2 brother sisters, but her novels Agnes Grey and The Tenant of Wilful Hall were still highly respected in their day. So why didn't they just use their real names? Well, back then, it was considered undignified for women to write novels. If women wrote anything, they wrote poetry. So women novelists had to hide behind pen names or no name. Like Jane Austen. She used, quote, "by a lady" for her first novel, Sense and Sensibility. And then Pride and Prejudice, her second novel, was credited to, quote, "the author of Sense and Sensibility." No one really knew who she was until after she died. For that matter, the New York Times just ranked My Brilliant Friend as the greatest novel of this century, of the 21st century. And like Jane Austen, no one knows anything about the author. Now, she did at least put a name on the cover. Whoever she is, she goes by Elena Ferrante. Also, authors, like actors, can get typecast. Like, if your name is so synonymous with murder mysteries that they literally call you the Queen of Crime, readers might not trust you to write anything else. That's why Agatha Christie used her real name for Murder on the Orient Express and Death on the Nile, but the name Mary Westmacott when she wrote what her mother described as, quote, bittersweet stories about love. That's right, Agatha Christie was a romance novelist. Who would have thought? Stephen King had to use a pen name because his publisher didn't want him to release more than one book a year out of the concern that he might cannibalize his own sales. So he used Richard Bachman for works like Thinner and The Running Man. Perhaps the most famous American pen name comes from Mississippi riverboat slang. For a riverboat to safely traverse the Mississippi River, the water had to be at least 2 fathoms deep. A fathom is 6 feet, so 2 fathoms is 12 feet. The boatman would mark that depth on a pipe and then drop it into the water. If the water was up to the mark, they would yell, "Mark, 2 fathoms!" No, actually they used an old school word for 2. They used twain. They said, "Mark Twain." A riverboat worker and writer named Samuel Clemens liked the sound of Mark Twain, and he liked it better than Thomas Jefferson Snodgrass, which was the pen name he was using at the time. So he changed it and then used it for Tom Sawyer, Huck Finn, A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, and everything else we know him for. Pen names are not a historic relic at all. Lemony Snicket and Cassandra Clare are both pen names. J.K. Rowling uses the name Robert Galbraith for books that aren't Harry Potter. There are so many more stories behind famous fake names, and I wish we had time to cover them all. But just know that the story doesn't always start when you open the book. Sometimes there's one right there on the cover. That's all for today's episode of 5 Minute Trivia. We'll see you next time. Thanks for listening.